The tape spins slowly. A faint hiss fills the room, like a whisper from another time. You can almost hear the echo of Sam Cooke in the distance, that warm, eternal voice that shaped the sound of soul itself. But behind that legacy was another man, quiet and unassuming, who carried the same fire in his heart. His name was Cecil Womack, a singer, a writer, a believer. Born in Cleveland, Ohio, raised on gospel hymns and church echoes, his life would take him from the pews of faith to the bright lights of fame, and then far beyond both. What happens to a man who gave everything to music and then walked away from it all? Let's get into their story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the name Womack ever appeared on a record, there was a small house on Cedar Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. Inside, the sound of gospel filled every corner. It wasn't polished or rehearsed, it was raw, loud, and full of faith. For the Womack family, music wasn't a dream, it was a way of surviving. Cecil was born on the 25th of September 1947, the fourth of 5 brothers. Friendly Jr., Curtis, Bobby, Harry, and Cecil. Their father was a minister who believed that music was both a calling and a discipline. Every Sunday, the boys sang in church, led by voices that carried the weight of hope through hard times. Their harmonies weren't learned from any school they were born from prayer, struggle, and the shared rhythm of family. In those years, Cleveland's East Side was alive with the pulse of Black America. Churches doubled as community centers, and the gospel circuit was a lifeline for families like the Womacks. It was there, on that modest circuit, that a legend would one day walk in and change everything. That legend was Sam Cooke. By the mid-1950, Cooke had already risen from the soul stirrers to become the golden voice of gospel. When he heard the Womack brothers perform, he recognized something rare, a blend of grit and grace that mirrored his own beginnings. He signed them to his SAR label, mentoring them as his protégés. Under Cooke's guidance, the Womack brothers transformed into the Valentinos. Their early gospel roots gave way to the irresistible pull of rhythm and blues. The world was changing, and so was the sound of America. In 1961, their single, Looking for a Love, climbed the charts, a sign that their leap of faith had paid off. For the first time, the Womacks were hearing their voices on the radio. Cecil was still just a teenager then, watching his older brothers step into the spotlight. Yet even in the background, he was absorbing everything, the studio sessions, the writing, the way Sam Cooke shaped a lyric to make it feel like truth. Cooke wasn't just a mentor to him, he was a mirror of what a black man could become in a world still learning to listen. But fame came at a cost. The shift from gospel to secular music drew criticism from the church community that had once embraced them. Some said they had turned their backs on God. Others whispered that they were chasing money, not ministry. For Cecil, it was confusing a young man torn between faith and the promise of a broader voice. He didn't yet know that this tension between spirit and success would define his entire life. When Sam Cooke was killed in Los Angeles in December 1964, the loss struck the Womacks like a thunderclap. Cecil was only 17. The man who had believed in them, who had given them a future, was gone overnight. In the aftermath, the group fractured under the weight of grief and scandal. Bobby's controversial marriage to Cooke's widow, Barbara Campbell, shocked the music world. For Cecil, the lines between family and fame had blurred into something painful. Still, music remained his refuge. While the Valentinos stumbled through uncertainty, Cecil began writing quietly, privately, as if putting his feelings on paper could make sense of the chaos around him. He wasn't chasing hits, he was searching for meaning. By 1966, the Valentinos regrouped under Chess Records, releasing Sweeter Than the Day Before, a song Cecil co-wrote with Mary Wells, the Motown icon who would soon become his wife. It was his first real step out of his brother's shadow. The song carried the optimism of youth, but beneath it was a longing that only he understood. Cleveland was far behind him now. The world he had known, Sunday choirs, neighborhood harmonies, the sound of his father's sermons was being replaced by tour buses, recording sessions, and hotel rooms. Yet somewhere deep inside, that gospel boy never left. He still carried the hymns of his childhood, even as the industry began to shape him into something new. Looking back, it's clear that Cecil Womack's early life was a reflection of America itself, filled with promise, faith, and contradiction. He was part of a generation that turned church songs into national anthems, that transformed pain into rhythm and survival into art. Before the fame, before the lights, there was just a boy in Cleveland, a boy who sang because the world outside didn't always listen. And even then, in the quiet corners of that small house, you could already hear it, the sound of legacy beginning to form. By the late 1960s, Cecil Womack was no longer the wide-eyed teenager singing harmony behind his brothers. The boy who once followed Sam Cooke through studio corridors had become a young man searching for his own rhythm, not just in music, but in life. When the Valentinos faded from the charts and the family's name grew quieter, Cecil's ambition only grew louder inside him. After years of living in the shadow of his brother Bobby, Cecil found another kind of light, one that didn't come from the stage. He had discovered that he was a writer, not just a performer. Songs came to him easily, like letters written from memory. He wasn't chasing trends, he was capturing emotion. In those years, Los Angeles was alive with the hum of new soul and R&B. The city was a strange mix of opportunity and heartbreak, glittering lights, empty promises, and endless talent trying to be heard. Within that world, Cecil met Mary Wells, the Motown star whose voice had once ruled the airwaves with "My Guy." She was already a legend by the time he met her, and for a young songwriter still proving himself, she seemed untouchable. But Cecil had something that caught her attention, a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from faith rather than fame. They began writing together, blending her smooth Motown charm with his raw, Southern gospel edge. Out of that partnership came songs like "The Doctor," "Dig the Way I Feel," and "Never Give a Man the World." Their chemistry was undeniable, not just in the studio, but in life. They married in 1966, forming not only a couple but a creative team. Together, they built a small music publishing company called Well Productions, a symbol of their faith and independence at a time when most artists were controlled by the big labels. It was a brave move, especially for a black couple in the 1960 music industry, but Cecil believed in ownership of his music, his name, his vision. Behind the scenes, he became known as one of the most intuitive songwriters in soul. He wrote with simplicity and purpose, blending gospel's depth with R&B's rhythm. One of his most timeless creations, Love TKO, would later become a major hit for Teddy Pendergrass, though few listeners knew it was Cecil's pen that had given the song its soul. While Mary Wells continued to perform, Cecil preferred the studio, the quiet hum of tape machines, the smell of cigarette smoke and vinyl, the long nights when inspiration came like prayer. He didn't crave the spotlight anymore. He wanted to build something lasting, even if no one ever saw his face. By the early 1970s, he had written for the O'Jays, Patti LaBelle, and the Four Tops. His songs carried a certain honesty, the kind that could only come from a man who had seen both the glory and the grief of the music world. For every song that charted, there were nights spent wondering if his voice would ever be enough. Cecil Womack was learning one of life's hardest lessons, that talent could open doors, but pain could teach purpose. The same faith that once guided his father's sermons was now guiding his pen. He wasn't chasing applause anymore. He was learning how to turn silence into music and heartbreak into art. Success, like love, can be fragile. By the mid-1970s, the partnership that once seemed unshakable between Cecil Womack and Mary Wells had begun to fracture. Fame had its own gravity, pulling them in different directions. Mary was still touring, her name echoing through the radio waves, while Cecil spent most of his time behind studio walls, writing, producing, and searching for a sound that felt like home. The marriage grew distant. Long tours turned into longer silences, and then came betrayal, the kind that leaves a scar no melody can heal. When Cecil discovered that Mary had been unfaithful with his older brother, the same family line that had once been his pride became his deepest wound. The divorce that followed in 1977 marked more than the end of a marriage. It was the closing of a chapter in his life. For a while, he drifted. Friends would later say that Cecil seemed caught between worlds, too spiritual for the industry, too honest for the fame game. But out of that loss came an encounter that would change everything. Her name was Linda Cooke. Linda was the daughter of Sam Cooke, the very man who had once shaped Cecil's destiny. Their meeting felt like something written long before either of them understood its meaning. In her, he found not just love, but continuity, a bridge to his past, and a partner who shared his belief in the healing power of music. Their relationship began quietly, almost secretly. Hollywood would have called it complicated. Cecil, the younger brother of Bobby Womack, now marrying the daughter of Sam Cooke while Bobby himself had married Sam's widow years earlier. But to Cecil and Linda, it was simple. They were two souls trying to create harmony in a world that often thrived on chaos. When they married, Cecil felt reborn. The noise of the industry no longer mattered. Together, they began to write under a single name, Womack and Womack. Their songs were not built for radio trends, but for truth. They poured into their lyrics the ache of heartbreak, the depth of faith, and the beauty of forgiveness. By 1983, they released their debut album, Love Wars, and it was unlike anything else in the soul scene at the time. It wasn't just about romance, it was about the struggle between the heart and the world. Every note carried the weight of experience, and every lyric sounded like it came from somewhere sacred. Love Wars was more than an album title. It was a confession. Behind its smooth melodies lay years of conflict, redemption, and grace. For Cecil, the record wasn't a comeback, it was a declaration that he had finally found peace within the storm. The album's success overseas hinted at something larger. Maybe his story was never meant to end in Hollywood. Maybe his music belonged to the world. While America was busy chasing the next big sound, Europe and Africa were listening. His songs resonated there, raw, soulful, human. Cecil had once written from a place of pain, but with Linda, he was writing from purpose. Together, they would soon carry that purpose across oceans, blending love and legacy into something eternal. And in that moment, far from the gossip, far from the glitter, Cecil Womack stopped being the man who followed others' footsteps. He became the man who carved his own. By the early 1980s, the name Womack and Womack had begun to travel far beyond the studios of Los Angeles. For those who listened closely, their sound was different, smoother than traditional soul, yet more spiritual than pop. It carried the pulse of gospel and the intimacy of confession. It was music that didn't just want to be heard, it wanted to be felt. Their first album together, Love Wars, released in 1983 under Elektra Records, was the culmination of everything Cecil and Linda had lived through: love, pain, forgiveness, and faith. It wasn't made for the radio, it was made for the heart. The songs unfolded like chapters in a diary. Love Wars, Baby I'm Scared of You, and their reimagined version of TKO all told the story of two people who had fought their way back to belief not in fame, but in each other. The album was modestly received in America, but across the Atlantic, it found an entirely different fate. In the United Kingdom, Love Wars reached number 14 on the charts, while critics hailed it as a revelation. The British press called them the first couple of honest soul, a title that touched Cecil more deeply than any award could. For the first time, he felt that someone truly understood the kind of music he and Linda were making, something sincere, lived in, and sacred. When they toured London, the audiences weren't just listening, they were worshiping. The Royal Albert Hall glowed with the warmth of applause that felt both grateful and reverent. Cecil would later say that in those moments, he realized that success wasn't about numbers, it was about connection. Following Love Wars, they released Radio Music, Man in 1986, a self-produced project that included unfinished songs by Sam Cooke, pieces Cecil and Linda completed with love and respect. It was like reaching back in time to hold a conversation with their mentor. The record didn't climb the charts, but it deepened their artistry. It was the sound of legacy continuing, echoing through generations. Cecil wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was chasing meaning. In interviews, he often spoke about how every note carried history: his family's, Sam Cooke's, the unspoken stories of the church choirs, and the small-town stages they had come from. He called it spirit music, a phrase that would later define the next phase of their lives. But Womack and Womack were not done yet. In 1988, their fourth studio album, Conscience, gave birth to a worldwide phenomenon. The single Teardrops exploded across Europe, reaching number 3 in the UK and topping charts in Australia, the Netherlands, and South Africa. It was more than a hit, it was a hymn. The song's refrain, simple yet haunting, "Whenever I hear goodbyes, remind me, baby, of you," carried the same quiet ache that had always lived in Cecil's work. It was about loss and love, but also about memory, the way time bends around the people we've loved and lost. For the first time in his life, Cecil stood under a global spotlight, not as someone's brother or protege, but as himself. And standing beside him was Linda, not just his wife, but his mirror, his muse, and his spiritual counterpart. Together, they weren't chasing charts. They were creating something eternal, a body of work that sounded less like a career and more like a calling. At the height of their success, Cecil and Linda Womack stood on stages bathed in light London, Paris, Johannesburg, Sydney. Audiences sang teardrops word for word, hands raised, faces glowing. The applause was thunderous, but inside, Cecil often felt the silence after the show louder than any ovation. Fame, he realized, was a mirror that never reflected the truth. Behind every smile was exhaustion. Behind every flight and interview was a longing for stillness. Even as conscience went gold and platinum across continents, he felt something slipping, an emptiness that success couldn't fill. Hollywood had always been a place of contradictions. It could build you up and forget you in the same breath. Cecil knew that well. He had seen it happen to Sam Cooke, to Mary Wells, even to his brother Bobby. For every hit song, there was a moment of quiet despair when the lights went out and no one called. During one late-night session, a friend recalled seeing Cecil sitting in the dark studio after everyone had left. When asked what he was thinking, he said softly, "I'm wondering what happens when the music stops." It wasn't a complaint, it was a question, one that had haunted him since Cleveland. Linda felt it too. Though the two were inseparable on stage, off stage they spoke often about purpose, faith, and identity. They had achieved what most artists only dream of: fame, freedom, and love, yet both felt an invisible weight pressing against their heart. In 1991, they released Family Spirit, an album that didn't chart but carried more soul than anything they'd done before. The title itself felt prophetic. It wasn't just about family as blood, but about belonging to something greater than the industry. One of its songs, Uptown, became a quiet hit in clubs, but Cecil didn't care about numbers anymore. He was searching for something music couldn't give him truth. That search would soon lead him away from the spotlight entirely. During a trip to Nigeria in the early 1990s, Cecil and Linda discovered what they believed were their ancestral roots. The experience was transformative. In the rhythms of African drums and the quiet dignity of the land, they found a sense of peace that no stage could provide. They adopted a new name, Zechariah, in honor of their lineage and spiritual rebirth. For Cecil, it wasn't an escape from fame, it was a return to faith. "We didn't leave America," he would later say. "We just went home." From that moment, the world of red carpets and award ceremonies became a distant memory. He no longer chased the spotlight. Instead, he turned toward something timeless: family, community, and the quiet hum of creation. But fame has a way of never truly letting go. Old fans wondered what happened. Record executives called, asking for another teardrops, another love wars. But Cecil had already said everything he needed to say. The industry wanted hits. He wanted healing. He spent his days writing, producing, and guiding his children into music. Nights were spent under the African sky, where the stars shone as bright as they once did on stage, only now they didn't blind him. For many, this was the moment when Cecil Womack disappeared. But for him, it was the first time he truly existed. Fame had faded quietly, like a record left spinning after the song was over. By the time the 1990 arrived, Cecil and Linda Womack, now known as Zechariah, were no longer in the headlines. But they were at peace with that. They had traded the noise of Los Angeles for the stillness of Lagos, and later for the distant hum of life in South Africa. To outsiders, it looked like a retreat. To Cecil, it was rebirth. He believed that the path to truth required silence. After decades of performing, touring, and chasing perfection, he finally allowed himself to breathe. For the first time since childhood, the rhythm of his life wasn't measured in chart numbers, but in sunrises and prayers. Yet peace, like fame, came with its own burdens. Living far from the industry meant losing its protection, the network, the income, the attention. Cecil's music had sustained him for years, but as the world moved toward a new digital age, his catalog became a whisper among louder voices. Younger artists dominated the airwaves, and the soulful, spiritual tone that had defined his generation felt like a language few remembered how to speak. There were reports that he struggled financially at times, relying on publishing rights and small tours, but those close to him said he never complained. He simply lived smaller, teaching, writing, mentoring, recording music that only a few would ever hear. He told one journalist, "If my music reaches 10 people, but it reaches them deeply, that's enough." Cecil's faith deepened as his world grew quieter. He studied African spirituality, the Bible, and the roots of gospel. His notebooks filled with reflections, not lyrics, thoughts about how art, when done honestly, becomes prayer. He and Linda began recording under their new family name, Zacharias, involving their children in every step. It was no longer about fame, it was about lineage. In 1993, they released Transformation to the House of Zechariah, a deeply personal album recorded under Warner Brothers. It was their last major release, filled with songs that sounded like hymns for a modern world. One track, Secret Star, became a modest hit in the UK, reaching number 46. But to Cecil, it wasn't success, it was closure. He didn't care for critics or numbers anymore. What mattered was the message. In one interview, he said softly, "The spirit doesn't chart on Billboard." But even as he found peace in creation, the world he left behind continued to forget. By the late 1990s, most American listeners no longer knew his name. To many, Womack and Womack was just a footnote in soul history. To Cecil, that was fine. Legacy didn't need recognition, it needed truth. And truth was all he ever chased, even when it led him away from everything he once knew. As the years passed, the distance between Cecil Womack and Hollywood became more than geography. It became time itself. The man who once stood beneath the bright lights of Los Angeles now woke to the soft dawn of South Africa. The applause had long faded, replaced by the sound of children's laughter and the rustle of wind through the trees. He still wrote songs, though fewer people heard them. Sometimes he would gather his family in a small home studio, his guitar resting across his knee. The melodies came slower now, but each note carried the weight of a life fully lived. There was no rush, no pressure, no audience to please. Music had returned to what it once was for him, a form of prayer. Those who visited during his final years said he was a man of peace, though his eyes still carried the quiet sadness of one who had seen too much. He didn't talk about the industry anymore. He talked about love, ancestry, and the cycles of the soul. When he spoke of America, it was with affection, not regret. "It gave me everything," he once said, "and took nothing I didn't give willingly." The couple continued to perform occasionally, mostly in Europe and Africa, where audiences still revered their legacy. The old songs, Love Wars, Baby I'm Scared of You, Teardrops carried a different kind of power now. They weren't reminders of fame, but of survival. Each performance felt like a reunion with ghosts, a way of saying thank you to the journey that had shaped them. In 2001, under their family name Zacharias, they released Subconscious, an independent project that blended soul, spirituality, and African rhythm. It wasn't meant for radio. It was meant for the heart. A few years later, they followed it with Circular Motion under their own Starship label, a nod to the circle of life they had come to understand so deeply. By then, Cecil's body was slowing, but his spirit remained sharp. He was still writing sometimes entire songs, sometimes single lines in a notebook filled with reflections. "We don't leave music," he wrote once. "It just changes shape like light." On the 1st of February 2013, Cecil Womack passed away in South Africa at the age of 65. The news traveled quietly, without fanfare. There were no televised tributes, no red carpet memorials. But for those who knew his voice, who had felt the depth of his songs, it was a loss that resonated deeply. He left behind not just records, but a family of musicians, children who carried his voice, his wisdom, and his belief that music is not fame, but faith made sound. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the world, when a record spins and an old soul song fills the room, you can still feel him there, a gentle reminder that some stars never fade. They just shine where fewer eyes can see. Cecil Womack left behind a legacy that could not be measured by awards or chart positions. His music lived quietly, like a sacred thread woven through generations of soul. For those who listened closely, his voice, both literal and written, carried something timeless. the conviction that art meant truth, not popularity. In the decades that followed his passing, his songs continued to travel not as headlines, but as whispers that never stopped echoing. Love, TKO. The song he had written years before fame ever found him became one of the most enduring R&B ballads in history. Teddy Pendergrass made it immortal, but it was Cecil's pen that gave it its heartbeat. Each time a new artist covered it, Michael McDonald, Daryl Hall, Seal, or even Bette Midler, they were unknowingly tracing the outline of his soul, and there were so many others. I Just Want to Satisfy You for the OJs, Love Symphony for Patti LaBelle, Your Song for the Four Tops. Cecil's writing carried fingerprints of faith and fragility, a balance only a man who had seen both heaven and heartbreak could create. He had turned personal truth into a universal language, one that spoke of loss, forgiveness, and the quiet power of endurance. Across the Atlantic, his name still meant something. In the UK, Europe, and Australia, Womack and Womack remained synonymous with purity artists who never bent to commercial pressure. Teardrops, their most beloved song, became a kind of cultural touchstone, a hymn for the broken-hearted that never aged. Decades later, it continued to be remixed, reimagined, and rediscovered by new generations who felt its emotional pulse. But what truly defined Cecil's legacy wasn't just his music, it was his philosophy. He had lived long enough to understand that greatness doesn't always need recognition. When you sing with truth, he once said, you don't have to shout. In an era when fame was fleeting and authenticity rare, he stood quietly apart. His career was a lesson in humility, proof that legacy isn't built in front of cameras, but in the spaces between the notes. Among musicians, his respect was immense. Songwriters, producers, and even gospel choirs spoke of him as a craftsman, a man who could turn a single phrase into something that felt eternal. He influenced countless artists who never even knew his name, simply by the spirit that lingered in his work. In interviews long after his death, fellow musicians would describe him as the keeper of soul's conscience, and maybe that was the right title, not a star, not a celebrity, but a guardian of truth through sound. Cecil Womack's legacy lived not on billboards, but in the moments when music stopped being background and became memory, the kind that makes a listener close their eyes, smile faintly, and remember something they once felt but could never explain. In the years after Cecil Womack's passing, something quiet began to happen. His music, once overlooked in his own country, started finding its way back to American ears. Digital platforms breathed new life into old vinyls, and the same songs that once filled European dance halls began showing up on playlists titled Real Soul, Timeless Voices, and Forgotten Legends. Younger listeners who had never known his name started to discover him not through fame, but through curiosity. They would hear Teardrops in a cafe or Love Wars in an old film and go searching. What they found wasn't just music, it was meaning. A voice that carried honesty in every line, a story that spoke to the balance between love and loss, faith and survival. In America, recognition came slowly. There were no grand retrospectives, no televised tributes. But among true soul enthusiasts, Cecil's name began to return in conversations about authenticity, about what it meant to make music that wasn't shaped by the market but by the soul. He became, in many ways, a secret treasure, the kind of artist you didn't just listen to, but felt you had discovered. Meanwhile, in Europe and Africa, his legacy never really disappeared. In the UK, Teardrops remained a perennial classic, still played on radio decades later. In Nigeria, fans remembered the man who had come seeking his ancestral roots, calling him the brother who came home. In South Africa, musicians often spoke of him as an adopted son of the continent, a man who had found peace in the same land that had once been a symbol of struggle. There's a kind of poetry in that, a soul singer from Cleveland finding his truest harmony not in the studios of Los Angeles, but in the quiet fields of Africa. It's as if his entire journey had been leading him there, from gospel to rhythm, from fame to faith, from noise to stillness. Even now, when his music plays, there's a warmth that feels human in a way modern recordings rarely do. It's imperfect, real, alive, like a heartbeat you can hear beneath the melody. That's what makes his legacy endure. It reminds us that music is not about perfection, but presence. Scholars of soul music often describe Cecil's life as a cycle of rediscovery, each generation finding him anew. For older fans, he remains a symbol of integrity. For younger ones, a revelation of what soul once meant before the world sped up. And in that space between generations, his name keeps echoing softly, insistently, like a prayer. He may never have received the mainstream recognition that others did, but perhaps that was never the point. Cecil Womack's legacy doesn't need to be rewritten. It only needs to be remembered. Because in remembering, we restore more than his music, we restore the idea that artistry, when born from truth, can outlive fame itself. They say history forgets. But every time a record spins, every time someone sings along to Teardrops, the silence breaks just a little, and Cecil Womack lives again. The tape spins again. That faint hiss, the same sound that opened our story, returns like a whisper from time itself. Somewhere between those fading echoes, you can still hear him, Cecil Womack, the quiet architect of soul. He was never the loudest voice in the room, but maybe that's why his music still lingers. It wasn't built for the moment, it was built for memory. Every lyric he wrote carried a piece of truth too fragile for headlines, truth about love, faith, and the cost of staying human in a world that forgets. Cecil's life reminds us that success isn't always about being seen. Sometimes it's about staying whole. He walked away from fame not because he had nothing left to give, but because he wanted to give something purer to his family, to his faith, to the earth that welcomed him home. When he passed in South Africa in 2013, it wasn't the end of his story. It was a return. The same child who once sang in a Cleveland church had finally found his peace under another sky, carrying the same song that had always been his, one of gratitude, courage, and quiet grace. Listen closely, and you'll notice something about Cecil's journey. It mirrors our own. The search for meaning, the longing to be understood. The hope that, even when the world moves on, what we've created still matters. He once said, "When you sing with truth, you don't have to shout." Maybe that's why his music endures. Because truth doesn't fade, it hums beneath the noise, waiting for someone to listen. So tonight, if you play Love Wars or Teardrops, don't just hear the melody. Hear the man, the believer, the dreamer, the artist who turned silence into song. Do you think Hollywood ever gave Cecil Womack the recognition he truly deserved? If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help us keep their light alive. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you remember a song that once made you feel something real, share it below. Because remembering is how legends live forever. Some stars never fade. They just shine where fewer eyes can see.